What's up, world? I'm Tristan Wade for mypokercoaching.com, and I'm here to talk to you today about poker straddles. And straddles are kind of fun, or they can be, but they can also alter how a poker game is played. So let's get into it. So poker straddles are basically another blind bet made before the cards are dealt, which essentially doubles the blinds and acts as a new big blind. In most cash games, only the first player to act can straddle. So that means you have the small blind, the big blind, and usually under the gun is the first player to act before the flop. They are typically the player allowed to straddle. Sometimes, though, other positions can straddle. It depends on the casino. It depends on the venue. There's other types of straddlers and straddles that we'll get into in later slides in this video. You cannot straddle in a tournament. It's not possible because when you straddle, action comes back to you and you get to act last. In a tournament, we don't allow that. So if you technically want to try to straddle in a tournament, which I sometimes do if it's early in a tournament, I'll try to appear more aggressive. I'll try to appear a little kooky, and it's technically a blind raise. So let's say I have 10,000 chips in a tournament and I get there at 50, 100. I might just min raise to 200 under the gun in the dark, and it's a min raise under the gun. It's not a straddle. So no matter what happens, I don't get a preference on what to do last before the flop in a tournament because I already chose my action. So that's where the difference comes from straddling in tournaments. It's just not a thing. It's a blind raise. But in a cash game, it's a real thing. So why do people straddle in a cash game? Well, the point is to make the game larger. Some people want to make the game larger because they might feel like they have an advantage against the players they're playing, and they might want to play bigger pots against those players. So that's one way to try to strategize if you want to make the game uncomfortable and make it a little bit bigger or just appear to be more aggressive. But straddling is almost always a losing proposition because you have to put in money before you see your cards. So why would anyone do that? Why would anyone want to play half a blind, a big blind, and then put two big blinds in? And it kind of goes to the reasons I stated earlier. Some people want to play bigger. Some people want to give the appearance of aggressive or actiony, and so they'll try to encourage straddles. And also, if I'm straddling and I can get other people to straddle, well, I'm sure they're not comfortable always defending their straddle or playing out of position or what have you. So it can be helpful if you are in the right situation. But back to how it's a kind of a losing proposition. It's the other part of the slide says the blind should be the only positions where you lose from. So adding an extra blind is not wise. And that's a key point, right? No matter when you play a cash game, you're always going to lose money in the small blind and big blind. And then that's it. But if you add a straddle, now you're losing twice as much as a big blind, and it's happening once in orbit every time around the table. So it's not that smart to do. Straddling also reduces post-flop edges because stacks are essentially halved if the straddle is two big blinds, right? Let's say you're playing $1, $2, and you have $200 in front of you, but all of a sudden someone comes along and straddles to $4. Well, your $1, $2 game where you sat with 100 big blinds, now when the big blind's $4, you only have 50 big blinds. So it can really hurt your post-flop advantage because now your stack's cut in half. And here's where the normal straddle happens typically. It's under the gun. So this is a normal poker table. These are the positions of a poker table. You have the small blind there with the SB, the big blind with the BB, and then under the gun here where this big red dot is would be the straddle, and it would just be called a straddle. The next to act would be under the gun typically, and then play would continue from that position. So it's basically a third blind in a normal straddle game. So again, I spoke on some of these things, but the normal straddle is the player to the left of the big blind puts in two big blinds. In the example I said earlier, in a 1-2 game, it would now be 1-2-4. And in some casinos, under the gun 1 could now re-straddle and put in 8, and that would make the game even more big. So there are straddles and re-straddles. Some casinos and properties allow that, some don't. And we'll get into some other nuances of the straddle and some other variants of the straddle here. The next one is called the Mississippi Straddle. And this can happen from any position here. You could straddle from under the gun 1, middle position, the cutoff, and that's what the Mississippi Straddle means. It basically means you can straddle from anywhere. So any player can post any amount from any position. That's kind of crazy. So if I just want to put $10 out there in a 1-2 game, some places will allow that. The straddler usually goes last pre-flop. So that's typically the rules of being the straddler, is you get to go last, but you're making the game bigger. And then in the Mississippi Straddle, it depends on the venue, but the player under the gun would usually go first, or the player to the left of the straddler goes first. So it depends on the venue, but that's kind of how the Mississippi Straddle works. It's either, okay, we go under the gun and let the normal action continue, or we just go to the left of the straddle until it gets back around to the straddler. And then the post-flop betting order is the same as normal. Obviously, the straddle is more of a pre-flop thing. Once we see a flop, the normal positions come into place, and whoever's to the left of the button gets to start the betting action. And then we have one of my favorite. This used to be a thing at one of my favorite casinos in the world, the Wynn Las Vegas. We used to play our cash games with a button straddle, but unfortunately they stopped letting us do that. But yeah, the other straddle you have is the button straddle, and that's, hey, you're on the button, you get to straddle, and then typically the small blind would go first, then the big blind would go next. So let's talk about that. So it's like a Mississippi Straddle, except it can only be done from the button. In most venues, like what was happening at the Wynn, the small blind would go first, the big blind would go next, and then it goes back around. So you can kind of see that puts the blinds in a worse situation than normal. And you could kind of probably figure why some people don't like that, because if you're already putting in money in these cash games, and now the person with the most advantageous position, the button, gets to now increase the game and get the blinds out the way, the people who have put the money in already, that really changes the dynamic of the game, because usually the people with the blinds get to go last and they get to see everything that happened. So their money that's in the pot already is kind of protected, but in the button straddle case, it would not be protected. So yeah, just another variant of a straddle, but something that can change the dynamics of the game pretty frequently. And again, sometimes the button straddle is capped at 2 big blinds. I see a lot of the straddles be capped at 2 big blinds in most places, but the Mississippi Straddle does still happen in certain venues. And then you have the Sleeper Straddle. This one can come from different positions. We have here in middle position this slide, but this is a little different of a straddle, and you can kind of understand what that means just by thinking of the name, the Sleeper Straddle. So what does that mean, Tristan, you might ask? Well, it's like a Mississippi Straddle, except it only becomes active when the straddle is folded to. The straddler is folded to. Straddle, straddler, these are weird words. But so yeah, you straddle. If everyone folds, normally the under the gun player goes first. If everyone folds, then okay, your straddle is live when it gets to you. But if someone calls or raises in front of you, if the action changes in front of you when you have a sleeper straddle, then your straddle is no longer allowed. It's void because the action's changed in front of you. And that's basically the explanation of that. You can see in the last keynote here, if someone calls or raises before the action gets to the straddler, they can take their straddle back and play the hand as if there is not a straddle. So the sleeper straddle is basically, if nobody plays in front of me, then my straddle becomes active, and then the people behind me have to play accordingly to that. And then, how do you combat straddlers? Well, most straddlers are far too aggressive pre-flop and post-flop, right? You can imagine if someone's just going to fire in a couple big blinds and try to get the game bigger, well, they're probably defending that straddle too liberally with weak hands. And then if they do flop like bottom pair or something, they're probably going to continue post-flop. So you can actually make money, good money in straddle games if you have the wrong people straddling and people just being too aggressive and playing big pots with weak hands and stuff like that. Now, this may force you to fold most speculative hands because you don't want to start entering the pot yourself with these weaker holdings just trying to pick off money in the middle. You really need to stay tight and sometimes even tighten your ranges if you're playing in big straddle games. If a straddler will raise over limps every time, then hey, great, let's set that fucking sucker up. Let's set him up. If I'm going to limp some big hands and this guy's always going to raise his straddle, well, yeah, I'm going to limp and then re-raise when he raises me. And that's kind of keys to the last point. If they will often 3-bet, well then, shoot, we want to raise and we want them to 3-bet us, and then we can either 4-bet them or we could play in or out of position with our hands. So personally, I'll just speak on a little experience myself. I like playing in straddle games. I don't mind playing bigger, but that's because the stakes I play, I'm comfortable if the blinds are doubled. But I also don't mind that because I want to play against people who are trying to push the envelope. I want to play against people who are aggressive. I want to play against people who are going to put me in tough spots and, maybe do things outside of the box. So the way I combat straddlers is I just play my ranges, I play solid hands, and then I play in position. And if I'm playing against someone who's way outside the box, then I'll step out of line too. But if I'm playing against straddlers who are more in line and more tight, then I'm not going to really try to attack those. The game's going to play more consistent how it will, but the game stakes will still be halved. So hopefully this video about straddling and the different types of straddlers and straddles and what you can do with that and how you play in those games, hopefully this video helps. I'm Tristan Wade for mypokercoaching.com. Thanks for watching.